Hi, I'm Nauka, and in this new UNICEF series, we're going to speak to a range of world-leading experts to explore childhood adversity, mental health and well-being, and love. We'll explore questions like, what can we do to protect and improve mental health in young people? How does adversity impact us as children and the adults we become? Why are safe and loving relationships so important to us growing up? In this episode, we're going to focus on the links between childhood adversity and mental health. And our guest is Vikram Patel, Professor of Global Health at Harvard Medical School and founder of Sankart. Welcome, Vikram.
Thank you, Laura.
I'd love to begin by asking, why is love so important for us in childhood and adolescence?
Quite simply because love, especially parental love in early childhood, followed by affectionate relationships from one's peers and teachers in our school years, are the single most important predictors of well-being and mental health throughout our life.
And what exactly is mental health?
But you know, Laura, when most people hear the word mental health, the first thing that comes to our minds is mental illness. And we must move beyond this binary approach that has really dominated conversations about mental health, that is to say, to divide the world into people with a mental illness and those without. We need to embrace the definition of mental health that the World Health Organization has coined, which is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of everyday life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make an effective contribution to his or her community. As you can see, that mental health therefore covers a range of human experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, our sensations, executive functions like our memory, and so on. In other words, Laura, mental health for me is our greatest personal asset, far more important than any physical attribute that we possess, and important to each of us at every moment of our lives. Now, some people often ask the question, how do you distinguish mental health from mental distress and mental illness? And I want to stress that there is no clear line in the sand that allows us to split people into these different categories. As a general rule of thumb, we really rely on the duration of distressing symptoms, on how pervasive those are. For example, how many different faculties of our mental health they affect, and the extent to which they interfere with our daily life. There is a certain subjectivity in separating out mental illness from mental health.
Thank you. Can you tell me a little bit about what we have learned about mental health problems across different cultures and societies?
You know, when I started work 25 years ago, there was a number of assumptions about mental health, which science has now proven to be myths. But let me just remind you of the sorts of questions and assumptions that were thrown at me. For example, was mental health really a problem of low-resource countries and settings? Wasn't this really a Western problem? Wasn't it a luxury for poor people and poor countries who had more important things to worry about, for example, shelter and their physical health? Wasn't it actually just an extension of social suffering? You know, if we couldn't really distinguish mental illness from mental ill health, how do you distinguish the kind of problems that one faces in the miseries of everyday life from mental health problems? Then there were the myths about the fact that they were not serious health conditions because they were not associated, as it were, thought with mortality. And finally, there was the assumption that it required enormous skills and very expensive interventions for recovery. 25 years later, with a very large body of evidence generated by colleagues from around the world, all of these assumptions have been proven to be false. We now know that mental illnesses are universal health experiences with very similar core features, although of course cultural factors do have an influence on how they're expressed and experienced. The core features are the same in all societies, and indeed, people respond to the same interventions in a similar way across contexts. We know today that mental health is inseparable from one's personal life story, especially the life story that we have in early childhood, but also one's physical health and one's current socioeconomic conditions. We know that mental health care must embrace a diversity of perspectives well beyond biomedicine, a diversity of experiences and providers. And finally, We know the huge importance that people, particularly people with a lived experience of mental health problems, must be central in all our conversations around mental health care.
You mentioned childhood experiences, and I wondered if we could dig a bit more into how childhood experiences impact mental health.
Laura, we've learned so much about the development of the brain in the last couple of decades, and this is how I'd summarize that knowledge. The brain is a work in progress throughout life, but especially so in early childhood, when there is, first, a rapid growth in the number of neurons, an astonishing million new neural connections that are being formed every second during certain periods of our early life. And this is then followed by a second phase, which is a process of pruning of those neural connections, which makes the brain more efficient. Now, both of these processes are key to understanding what we refer to as brain plasticity, which is simply the process of the exquisite dance that the developing brain plays with the environment. By the environment, I mean the social environment that a child is in. Quite simply, this social environment is critical in shaping the brain in ways that influence our mental health, our learning abilities, and even our physical health throughout the rest of our lives. In particular, the presence of a loving caregiver, most commonly, of course, that's going to be a parent, who is responsive to the child's needs, provides a stimulating environment, and protects the child from stressful situations, and particularly chronic, unrelenting stress in early childhood, such as that what might be caused by extreme poverty or repeated abuse. These are the most critical ingredients for promoting healthy child development and better health across one's life course.
What I find particularly heartbreaking is that not all children are born into circumstances where they have at least one loving, safe relationship. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what can be done to act on the science and promote good mental health for all, and also how we protect the children who weren't lucky enough to have someone there to love them and keep them safe.
For me, adverse childhood experiences are the equivalent for mental health as tobacco is for physical health. We have got a smoking gun. And I think it is important for us to recognize that in addressing adverse childhood experiences, we will not only improve mental health, but we will also have enormous benefits on physical health, on learning abilities, and on economic productivity. Now, when people think of adverse childhood experiences, Laura, many people think in extreme ways. For example, that we're referring to very, very extreme adversities like sexual abuse. But the commonest kinds of adverse childhood experiences are fairly pervasive in society, and they are primarily driven by household poverty. Now, neuroscience indicates that early interventions in the first few years of life are far more efficient and will produce much better longer-term outcomes than any interventions later in life. And thus, early childhood interventions that focus on the parent-child relationship is the best investment that society can make to improve the chances of a long, healthy, and fulfilling life. Now, babies' brains require stable, caring, loving relationships with adults, and of course, the most important adult will be a parent. And I want to alert all your listeners to the basic principles of UNICEF's nurturing care framework for early child development that really embraces this idea of loving relationship with one's adults. But for us to achieve this goal, we need to recognize, as you rightly pointed out, that many parents struggle to provide such nurturing environments, not because they are irresponsible, not because they don't love their child, but because of enormous challenges that many parents face, foremost of which are the crushing daily task of simply surviving poverty. But also to that, I would add, struggling with conflicts with one's partner and living, of course, with a mental health problem oneself. All of these, Laura, can be addressed with appropriate policies. For me, love is like a flower which needs a fertile soil and plenty of sunlight and water to flourish. It is society's responsibility that every parent has access to the sunlight and water they need to let their love bloom.
How do we go about trying to create the best circumstances possible for the flowers to bloom?
So, I mentioned earlier that social environments are extremely central in thinking about how we shape our brains and ultimately our mental health and well-being. And we have to think about how social environments differ at different stages of the life course. Before you go to school, the dominant social environment is going to be the parenting environment at home. But once you go to school, school environments become increasingly important. As you grow into adolescence, in fact, the peer environment becomes extremely important. And here we need to recognize the importance of relationships within schools with one's peers and with one's adults. But as you grow into young adulthood, the relationship we have with communities that we live in. And so, for example, the sorts of social strife that we see in many societies these days, due to the polarization that we see in many societies, undoubtedly affects the mental health of young people. And increasingly so, Laura, there is a new environment that did not exist when I was a young person, which is the social media environment in which the influences that shape our mental health have gone way beyond the in-person relationships we have with our peers, our parents, and our community members. We are now having our mental health shaped by people we have never met in places and contexts that we've never visited.
Yeah, I have to say I find that latter point slightly worrying, and I worry that there's not enough regulation on that, but maybe that's for another time. Could you tell me a little bit about what has already been rolled out and has been successful around the world in terms of bolstering and supporting each of those avenues that you spoke about?
So one of the most exciting things about loving one's child is that this is not just some fluffy middle-class idea, but in fact, it has been shown to be a very powerful intervention which can be operationalized. And when it is delivered well, and by delivered well, I mean supporting parents to provide responsive and stimulating environments for their very young children. In fact, it leads to very large benefits in terms of children's cognitive development and achievements, and therefore their learning abilities, and ultimately their mental and physical health. The real challenge today is not asking the question, does love help? No, the question really is, how do health systems, how do societies respond to this evidence by supporting parents who are in need of that kind of support to deliver loving environments for their children? How do we create a scaffolding that makes sure that every child and every family is able to deliver on the science in a way that promotes healthy development and health for all children in every society equitably?
And there is research, isn't there, that parenting interventions have been successful. So when there is evidence behind what you're suggesting, it's not just something you've randomly come up with.
There is a giant body of evidence on early child development. It's a low-hanging fruit. If any society wanted to change the trajectory of the health and economic productivity of its young people, it should put $9 out of every 10 that it is investing in the early childhood years. There is no doubt about the evidence in terms of the benefits, and particularly on how much more cost effective it is to start earlier in life.
I feel like there's a variety in terms of how adults relate to their own childhoods, and in terms of how they connect their own emotions and difficult experiences, and how they regard mental health. And I worry that some of the people making decisions aren't really giving the appropriate weight to the importance of childhood development and well-being and the protective factors and everything that we've talked about. If someone's had a difficult upbringing themselves, then they may be more likely, this is massively oversimplistic, but just to illustrate my point, they may be more likely to think, oh, well, you know what, it's good for them, or, children are resilient, or perpetuate loads of myths that don't actually help children.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I think it's not just that we are not thinking about young children. We certainly are not. The fact that, for example, in a lockdown, young children in vulnerable homes have been trapped in their homes with parents who might actually be in constant conflict with each other. There has been a lot of concern about the increased exposure to abuse, neglect, and violence in the home. There's no real response to that. Similarly, we also have neglected the needs of poor people, regardless of whether they have children or not. For example, remote learning is much harder for poorer kids because they may not have space in their homes for privacy that is needed in remote learning. They might not have devices. And in many parts of the world, there's not even any internet. And so these policies have been designed by wealthy people, older people, and we have not really taken into account the impact, the disparate impact this has across the life course and also across the different social strata that exist in all societies.
And I'm also worried that the children from backgrounds that are less supportive or perhaps have digital poverty as well might then, suffer disproportionately because they're then behind the people who aren't who aren't digitally poor. So, there's the kids who continue to learn in supportive environments and the people that just don't for that whole period.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this move to digital learning has two problems. At least two. The first is it presumes all kids have equal access, which of course is a complete lie. And so in fact, by focusing on digital learning, you are widening disparities that already existed historically. But the second problem is a more fundamental one because it presumes the only function of schools is learning. But that is not the case. Kids don't go to school only to learn. If you ask a kid why they go to school, most times they will say it's to play. Most times they'll say during the recess, it's to connect with my friends, it's to play football, whatever. But it's not to learn geography and history. And I think the other important thing that actually many kids, particularly poorer kids, get out of school is escape. Escape from often a very difficult and often a very harmful environment into an environment in which they are with other kids, where there is a much greater degree of freedom, physical freedom and psychological freedom. And of course, for many, many kids around the world, the school is the only place they will get their main meal of the day. Now, have we thought for a moment that schools are far more than just mechanical learning environments? No, we haven't. Because all our emphasis on schools is like we could just shift everything to a Zoom platform. And that in itself demonstrates that we have no idea of the broader social roles that schools play in providing loving and nurturing environments for children and young people.
So given everything we've discussed, if you were in charge and you could make all the policy decision makers in the whole world listen and do what you say, what would you want?
So first of all, I would say when it comes to first of all, I'd say when it comes to mental health, we must move beyond binaries and recognize the diversity of human experiences that comprises mental health. Second, that we know very clearly what predicts good mental health and well-being throughout our life course, and that is nurturing and loving environments in the early years of our life, stretching all the way into young adulthood. And third, intervening through delivering interventions that we know can promote those nurturing environments is the single best economic investment that any society can make to strengthen not just health and well-being across the life course, but also economic productivity.
Thank you, Vikram, for your generosity, wisdom, insight, and generally being horrendously articulate about everything. And thank you for watching. In the next episode, we'll be speaking to Cornelius Williams, Global Head of Child Protection for UNICEF, who has more than 25 years of experience of protecting children around the world. Hopefully see you then.